In the name of God, most gracious, most compassionate, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome you all to the Doha Forum, the platform we launched 19 years ago for dialogue and exchange of ideas. At that stage, discourse about a better future for humanity started when the two-camp system and the Cold War had come to an end, and then talk about the Millennium Goals, followed by the Sustainable Development Goals, had become possible, and hence the world and our forward-looking to its future seemed more optimistic. The concepts of international community, international legitimacy, joint responsibility, and multilateral action were on the rise. Yet, where are we today from all this? The balance has been tipped in favor of the visions that are skeptical of the importance of joint responsibility and international law as a universal reference, which in turn gave way to invoking the law of force on the international scene rather than working to strengthen the power of law. The sources of defects that prompted many people to lose faith in the efficiency of the existing global systems and mechanisms, including double standards, must be addressed. Sincere efforts should also be intensified in drafting new visions for the next stage, especially after the consequences of abandoning international legitimacy and international law emerge in more than one place, including our region. This is exactly the focus of this year's Doha Forum report entitled Reimagining Governance in a Multipolar World. It is not yet clear whether what has happened since that stage is a transition from unipolarism to multipolarism, or a state of fragmentation and an attempt by major powers to disavow their duties and responsibilities. The situation were just an issue of multipolarism, there would not have been a problem, since multipolarism does not prevent integration of roles and may also enrich international relations with different perspectives. But if it were translated into a mere rivalry for influence between different axes without agreed universal responsibilities and visions for the interest or in the interest of the world, then this would be considered a return back even further than the bipolar stage when two perceptions for a better world were competing in the shadow of mutual deterrence. The common international vision that appeared to be clear at the beginning of the new millennium is now blurred, whether from the perspective of the international legitimacy, issues of poverty, environment, climate, and accountability of war criminals. However, the problems and challenges have remained the same. While environment and climate issues are exacerbated, the issue of chronic poverty in vast areas across the world has not yet been resolved, as well as the issue of occupation and annexation of others' land by force. As you all know, there's a very close relationship between poverty, wars, and the aggravation of asylum and immigration issues. Armed militias have taken advantage from axis conflicts, and the process of holding war criminals accountable became too complex. These problems cannot be solved without coordinated international efforts and shared visions, such as the issues of violent extremism, which is not restricted to a religion or a race, which targets the innocent, makes no distinction based on gender, racial, or religious grounds. We in Qatar have committed ourselves not to merely criticize the situation, but rather try and contribute to answering these questions, even if partially. In addition to our policies based on respecting international law and legitimacy and contributing to resolving conflicts peacefully through mediation and providing a space for dialogue, we've also established platforms such as the Doha Forum and the Interfaith Dialogue Doha Conference, which we launched 16 years ago for building bridges. Doha has witnessed this year alone important international conferences, such as the World Interparliamentary Union and the International Conference on Disability and Development, which took place last week in cooperation with the United Nations. As for the relief and development issues, I announced on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly session last September the allocation of $100 million to small island states to cope with climate change. The state of Qatar has also pledged to provide education to 1 million young children in conflict areas by the year 2021, in addition to the efforts of non-profit Qatari organizations, such as the Education Above All Foundation, which works alone to provide education to 10 million children in conflict areas around the world. This is a modest effort in a world where 262 million children worldwide are outside educational institutions, in addition to conflict zones where 27 million children are deprived of their basic right to education. But we are doing our part. The Qatar Development Fund contributes around $600 million annually to relief, educational, and health projects in about 59 countries across all continents. Also, Qatar Charity contributed about $400 million to development projects for the benefit of about 10 million people in 50 countries. As for Silatech, an organization concerned with the economic empowerment of women and children, especially in the Middle East and Africa, it has empowered about 1.6 million children and women to date. Silatech organization has also set a target to empower 5.8 million children and women by 2022. Undoubtedly, humankind is faced with multiple difficult challenges, but there's also an abundance of goodness, giving, sincerity, determination, and innovation that can be relied upon. So we must all celebrate goodness and human achievements wherever they are found. It is precisely for this purpose that I'm pleased today to initiate a new tradition of honoring a global personage in this forum. This year's personality is a role model of good governance. He has managed to achieve a tremendous development in economy, education, and production in his country. He also fought against class discrimination to make education and health a right for all of his countrymen, while promoting religious coexistence and community peace, as well as fighting corruption, supporting the just and fair causes around the world, in addition to his determination and persistence that neither time nor age have caused to wane. We stand in front of a young man, without exaggeration, who embodies ambition, achievement, and perseverance, although he's over the age of 90. We are standing before a sage who reflects wisdom, insight, and patience in every sense of these words. Ladies and gentlemen, this year we honor my dear brother, His Excellency Dr. Mahathir bin Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, for his entire accomplishments. I invite everyone to join me in greeting.
Congratulations, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad. May I please invite you now to the lectern to deliver your remarks.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, Amir of the State of Qatar, Her Excellency Al-Khatir, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar, Executive Director of Doha Forum, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I wish to extend my heartiest congratulations to the State of Qatar for hosting this 19th edition of the annual Doha Conference. I thank the State of Qatar for the warm hospitality accorded to me and my delegation, as well as the excellent arrangements made for this event. I am pleased to announce that I had a very fruitful meeting with His Highness, the Amir, during my official visit to the State of Qatar 2 days ago. Today, it is indeed a pleasure to be here with all of you at this Doha Forum 2019. I'm sure the presence of His Highness, the Amir of Qatar, will enable us to engage in fruitful political discourse and exchange of ideas. Furthermore, with the attendance of the leaders, heads of international organizations, non-governmental organizations, policymakers, think tanks, academics, journalists, and other influential individuals, we may also be able to find practical and action-oriented resolutions to solve global challenges as well as the pursuing our plans in achieving higher and better living standards for our people. I'm here to speak on matters relating to the theme of this year's Doha Forum, Reimagining Governance in a Multipolar World. And I will speak from Malaysia's experience and perspective. Your Highness, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, just as this event signifies, it is important for all countries in the world today to work together and learn from each other on issues that could affect the way we approach the world. No country can live in isolation. For Malaysia, we are not seeking alignments. We need partners. We need friends. We are at a point in history where countries will need to have relationships across a broad spectrum. We have to accept the fact that we neither live in a unipolar world nor in a bipolar world. We live in a multipolar world in which there should be no hegemonic nation, but interconnected relationships that go in multiple directions, in multiple directions. In other words, it could be described as an integration of diversity and creativity among cultures, nations, and economies of the world. We must acknowledge the fact that isolationism is now impossible. Advances in communication have made us all next-door neighbors with porous borders. There is even interconnectedness between human societies, which can fuel economic, social, and political changes across the globe. We are seeing massive movements of people, bringing with them not just differences in ethnicities, but also language, culture, and value system. Countries that still believe in hegemony will only create friction, tension, and instability. Therefore, a multipolar world has to be combined with greater integration among friends and partners, as well as continued multilateral diplomacy in the global arena. The first place we look for friends and partners is of course, our neighbors. We have a slogan in Malaysia which calls upon us to prosper thy neighbor. This is the antithesis of the common saying, beggar thy neighbor. Today's world is confronted with increased concern over the sustainability of global economic growth in the face of rising financial, political, social, and environmental challenges. In Southeast Asia, 10 countries decided to work as a group. The net result is stability and prosperity. As one of the founders of the ASEAN grouping, Malaysia continues to play a significant role in ASEAN's community building and regional integration. It has been the cornerstone of our foreign policy, despite its members' diverse political, economic, and cultural fabrics. ASEAN has maintained peace and stability within the region for the past 52 years. We don't believe in applying sanctions to force countries to accept certain ideologies and to change governments. It is not only the particular country which will suffer, but all the trading partners also will suffer economically. There is no international law which permits this. It is totally unjust, as only the powerful can take this action. The weak can only suffer. In a way, it is a form of dictatorship, a dictatorship that is worse than that in a country. It is international. Your Highness, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, trade war, like all wars, is primitive. And like all wars, it favors the strong against the weak. It is the choice of bullies. It is unworthy of our claim to be concerned about human rights and values. The people who suffer most are the poor people. They are the people to suffer from deprivation, from high costs, shortages, and the like. Conflicts over trade will occur, but their resolution must be through negotiation, arbitration, or through a court of law consented to by the countries concerned. In all conflicts, there must be a willingness to give up something in order to get something. Rigid stance will solve nothing. In order to get something, rigid stance will solve nothing. Even in a war, in the end, someone must lose, so the other can win. But termination of wars or conflicts through compromises will provide a win-win, lose-lose solution. This would be the result whether the solution is through wars or peaceful means. The difference is that people will not be killed as in wars, but the winner will get something intact. Malaysia is deeply concerned with the current global economic situation, particularly the swing to the right, in which national interest supersedes international well-being. Multilateralism is now being relegated to the rear. This is happening at a time when advances in communication has brought all the nations of the world so close to each other. Globalization and a borderless world were invented in the developed countries, I suspect it is because they see huge potential for them to enjoy an unrestricted world market. There will be free competition between the countries of the world, but the countries of the world are not of equal development. The weak will obviously lose or gain less in a free-for-all market. Clearly, this multilateral, globalized, borderless world is not going to be good for the developing world, but there could be negotiations so that all the countries will gain something, so that a multilateral world would not be detrimental to the economies of the developing countries. We have to remember that for many poor countries, import duty provides them with much of their revenue. Borderlessness means they will lose this income. It is important that they be compensated in one way or another. But between developing countries, free trade can be more beneficial. It is important, therefore, that the developing countries adhere to multilateralism. Malaysia is a friendly country. We want to be friends with everyone and enemy of none, with one obvious exception. Our population is too small to provide a good market. We need the global market. There is no provision in the UN that allows one country to impose unilateral sanctions on another country. Unilateral sanctions create problems for other countries as well. Malaysia and many others lost a big market when the US sanction is applied against Iran. Malaysia does not support the reimposition of the unilateral sanction by the US against Iran. Such actions clearly violate the United Nations Charter and international laws. Sanctions can only be applied by the United Nations in accordance with the Charter. I wish to reiterate my address at the United Nations General Assembly on this issue. If we want to have sanctions, let us have a law to govern sanctions. Your Highness, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, climate change is another issue that is posing a grave threat to food security, access to clean water, livelihoods, infrastructure, economic and socio-cultural development gains. It is of real concern to all of us. The global nature of this phenomenon requires a concerted and coordinated global response by all countries to address the current climate impacts and to reduce future impacts of climate change. For Malaysia, we have already begun undertaking measures to reduce emissions and to deliver our part of the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. These are our efforts to prevent the devastating impacts that climate change may bring, not just for us, but for our future generations. In closing, I would like to point out that this year's conference shows that the state of Qatar is on the right track in addressing pertinent issues that are happening in our world today. Events such as these are fertile grounds for experts of various fields to impart knowledge, share best practices, and seek workable solutions that can be immediately implemented for the betterment of all. I have high hopes that this conference will be productive and fruitful for all of us. I thank you.
In a career spanning more than 70 years, His Excellency Dr. Mahathir bin Mohamad has demonstrated how conviction, empathy, and a commitment to dialogue can be a model for global leadership. A fierce advocate for Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir has provided a steady vision for inclusion and development. Presiding over a period of rapid modernization, he has worked to transform the Malaysian economy and make the region among the most dynamic in the world. Dr. Mahathir's tenure has coincided with the emergence in Malaysia of strong governing systems, anti-corruption efforts, and robust civic engagement. Dr. Mahathir's style of diplomatic pragmatism is rooted in his experience of a deeply multicultural nation, allowing him to play a unique and important role in the post-colonial transition of Southeast Asia. For this, we recognize Dr. Mahathir bin Mohamad as the inaugural winner of the Doha Forum Award, celebrating our values of dialogue, diplomacy, and diversity.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sami Zaidan, senior presenter from Al Jazeera International. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you today. My pleasure to be here as well with His Excellency Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, as we begin an interview. Thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera, first of all. A pleasure to be here with you. You've accepted now this Achievement Award, and I want to delve back into some of the highlights in your career. You were nicknamed Bapa Pemodanan. For those who are not familiar with Bahasa, that means the father of modernization. It's in reference, of course, to the dramatic transformation that took place in your country while you were Prime Minister. I want to know, though, how you see yourself. Do you think Malaysia could have made that achievement and that transformation without you?
Well, in order to grow a country, to develop a country, the first need is for stability. Ours is a multiracial nation, and normally multiracial nations are not stable. So the first job that I had to do was to make sure that all the different races work together for the country. Then, of course, that means, of course, that all the different races are represented in the government, and they can speak for their own race and also for the nation. And because everybody has a fair share in the governance of the country, they feel satisfied that their problems will be taken care of. And that leads to stability where development becomes possible.
But many countries have tried that approach. Malaysia has been more successful than some. Just to give an example, Malaysia's GDP upon independence was comparable to Ghana, for example. But today, it's around 6 times higher. Surely there have been other secrets to this success.
Well, the secret is that when you are placed as a leader in the country, you must have some ideas. You must have some ideas gleaned probably from watching what happens in other countries. In the case of Malaysia, we decided that instead of looking west, we should look east, because in the east we find countries like Japan, Korea, and the like, and they seem to have been able to overcome their difficulties and develop their country. So look east becomes a Malaysian policy, and that has contributed much towards our development.
One of the things you're renowned for is a crucial decision you made during the 1997 Asian crisis not to follow the IMF prescriptions. And it turned out well for Malaysia in the end. Malaysia transitioned that crisis quicker than some of the other countries that did follow the international advice. I want to know what made you decide to take a bold decision and break ranks with others.
Well, for a year, I watched the country's currency being devalued, and that makes us very poor. We thought of all kinds of solutions, but not being a financier, not being an economist was a great, does not prevent me from, not prevent me from accepting radical ideas or ideas that are not common.
Did you ever have any doubts? Did you ever have any doubts? It must have been a difficult decision to make.
Well, it was a frightening decision to make, to go against the whole world. But I thought that it would work, and well, we had to take the risk. And we plunged into this thing, and fortunately for us, that stopped the currency from depreciating because we fixed the exchange rate, and from then onwards, Malaysia recovered.
You made some bold comments in your speech today, and I'm wondering, do you think the IMF still continues to give sometimes the wrong advice to countries?
Well, the IMF eventually agreed that what I did was right, and I hope that the IMF will not be so conventional as to always recommend the normal thing, the expected thing.
How has your time in politics changed you, not just as a politician, but as a human being?
Well, I decided to resign after I've been in government for 22 years, thinking that younger people should take over. And I wanted to retire really, but after some time, lots of people came and asked me, please do something about what's happening in the country. Eventually, I had to do something, and that involves coming back.
A head of state once told me that no matter how principled you start out in politics, at some point you are going to have to, as he put it, dance with the devil. Do you agree with that? Have you ever had to make decisions which haven't sat 100% comfortably with your conscience?
Well, when you are ignorant about the normal things, then you can do abnormal things. So at times, of course, I get frightened with my own decisions, but you have to try out something in order to solve an issue that seems not being solved through conventional means.
So you've never had to make a decision that do you have any regrets? Do you feel like there's something you would have done differently?
Well, there are things that I feel, of course, during my time. I made decisions which I thought would solve the problem, but in the end, I found that it was not effective.
What achievement are you most proud of, and what would you consider to be that biggest mistake?
Well, in our country, there are three major races, but they are not developing equally in their search for wealth, for example. And I thought that this is a problem of culture, of value system. So I tried to change the value system of the ethnic group which are behind, but I failed in that effort.
Looking forward to the KL summit, the Kuala Lumpur summit, you're the chairman of it. What must the KL summit achieve in December 2019 in order for it to be a success?
I've been watching the development in the Muslim world. Almost all Muslim countries are not considered as developed, not a single one. And then we see a lot of troubles in many Muslim countries, which failures of governance, and also they've been fighting each other, and there have been people from Muslim countries have run away from their own countries to seek security in other countries. So these are major problems, and many of them have been expelled from their country, hounded, and killed and tortured. These are the problems which we have to understand. Why is it happening? And if we know why, maybe we can find some solution.
For solutions of the nature you're talking about, though, when it comes to uneven development, one would have to look deeper into some of the countries you're referring to, which, according to international statistics and report, indicate a level of mismanagement, lack of democracy, uneven access to resources. Can there really be a renaissance? Can you even address that properly in a summit without tackling some of these issues?
Well, in the first place, we need to understand the problem. We need to see the background to the problem.
Do you think the leaders of the Muslim world understand that problem? Do you think the leaders of some of those countries who are attending the KL summit truly understand the problem?
I think I've talked with them personally in small, when I met them, and they seem to have the same concern as many other Muslim leaders have. And I think it is about time we sit down seriously to look at this problem and to find solutions.
Do you think the launch of the KL summit in itself is an indication of the failure of other initiatives like the OIC?
Well, the OIC is a big grouping of 52 over countries. When we have too many people, finding some consensus becomes very difficult. But with only 5 countries, it's much easier to reach
You think you'll be
consensus.
more effective? Yeah. You've also commented on some of the global trends going on in the world today. I wonder if I can get you to talk a little bit more about them, specifically about the issue of trade wars, which you mentioned. Do you think the US and China have been too rigid in how they've approached trade issues?
Well, trade wars do not solve anything. They only antagonize people, and other people not related to the war suffer. So I think all conflicts between nations should be settled through negotiation, arbitration, or a court of law. That is how Malaysia solved its problem over overlapping claim between its neighbors.
But are they failing in that regard, the US and China? Are they being too rigid in their stances they're taking right now?
But there is too much politics involved, not economic sense. If you follow economic rules, I'm not an economist, perhaps you can solve the problem in a much better way than confrontation and trying to destroy each other.
All right, and you also mentioned multilateralism and the rise of the right. Are you comfortable with the direction that the current US administration, the Trump administration, is leading the world in with regard to multilateral action?
Well, I cannot say but what the US doing now is the right thing. Becoming very nationalist is good, but not at the expense of other people. We believe that every country should care about itself, but that being needing to be protected or secure does not mean confronting others. It's better if we learn to work together in a multilateral world, because whatever a big country does, it affects other countries, especially the poor countries. So that is not a solution. We were going a long way towards multilateralism, but now nationalism seems to affect many countries, and they are more right today than they were left, or even mid-center as before.
You also mentioned sanctions on Iran. Will you be rallying, trying to take action to mitigate and counter the unilateral US sanctions on Iran?
Well, ours is a very small economy by comparison to the US. We have a trade surplus with the US. Obviously, we don't like the idea of sanctions. So what we can do is just to preach the values of peaceful resolution to conflicts, rather than confrontation, sanctions, and the like.
you also mentioned the issue of retirement. And for any leader, no matter how great a run they've had in office, one of the issues that comes up is when they will leave the political stage and what will happen next. One of the questions that's burning right now in the Malaysian media, or is being talked and discussed about a lot, is whether 2020 will be the last year for Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad as Prime Minister of Malaysia. Will it be, sir?
Which part of it?
Will 2020 be the year in which you decide to exit the office of Prime Minister?
Yeah. Well, we had a vision to become a fully developed country by the year 2020. Unfortunately, after I stepped down, the leadership took a different course, different policies, and that caused the target not to be achieved in 2020. So what we have settled for is that we will still try, but we have moved the accomplishment date from 2020 to between 2025 and 2030. There is a new approach to solving our economic problem, and this time around, we want everybody to benefit and not any particular group only.
So if I understand correctly, you feel there's a need, the country needs your leadership well beyond 2020.
Well, I have promised that I would step down once I have resolved some of the major problems that has been left by the previous government. I promise that I will step down and give the leadership to a candidate that has been named by the coalition.
Talking about issues that need to be resolved, can you say 2020 will be the year that the sedition law, the Security Offences Act, will be repealed? Some of the tools that were used by the previous administration to suppress civil liberties. Of course, the ruling coalition, your ruling coalition, it campaigned on a platform to scrap some of these, but there's been criticism that you haven't moved quick enough. Will 2020 be the year in which some of these tools will be repressed, repealed rather?
The problems were very big, very serious. You cannot achieve success in our efforts to overcome the problems overnight. It takes time. We are given actually 5 years to accomplish this objective. But in the first year, 1.5 years now, we have solved many of the problems. For example, the huge borrowing by the previous government should make us bankrupt. But we managed to overcome that because we managed the finances of the country much better than before. We are also still very stable as a nation, despite the fact that there is a sudden change of government, which has never changed for the past 60 years. Normally, when there is a change of government, it causes disruption. There would be demonstration in the street, there would be strike, there might even be violence. But in Malaysia, the switch from the previous government to the new government went off very smoothly, which is something we didn't expect because we had never experienced changes of government. So to that extent, we have done fairly well, I would claim. But there are other areas. For example, we found that corruption was the one that brought down the previous government. We have taken steps to the extent that today no one complains about corruption. They may complain about delays in making decisions and all that, but delays, of course, happens when a new government takes over. And
right. You have made, I think even your critics will agree that you've made a lot of progress, but still specifically there are some issues. Can you give a timeline for scrapping some of those laws I mentioned and for passing the bill called the Independent Police Complaints and Misconduct Commission, which the opposition is pushing for? Can you say 2020 is when you'll get civil liberties in order?
There are some laws which need to be revised or amended, but some of these laws have got their, are practically guaranteed by the constitution of the country. If we have to change the laws, we need to get the constitution of the country also allowing us to do it, or at least making changes that will enable us to change the laws. But to change the constitution requires a two-thirds majority. Our government has not got the two-thirds majority. We need to depend upon the opposition. But the opposition, of course, is not very forthcoming.
Okay, we've just got a minute left, so I want to ask you a final point. Do you think the leader of the ruling coalition, Anwar Ibrahim, is the best person to take over at some point? Would you endorse him?
Well, I cannot guarantee who would be the best person to take over, because I've had bad experience. I have named my successors, and when they took over, they do different things.
Do you have any regrets about, I mean, you've had a, let's say, an off and on relationship with Anwar Ibrahim. Any regrets about how that has transpired in the past?
Before, of course, we were antagonistic towards each other, but we realized that the country's needs is more important than our personal feelings. So we decided to forget the past and concentrate on developing the country. That is more important than our quarrels.
Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera. I think we can...
Very much indeed, Dr. Mahathir. Thank you, Sami, for a great discussion. Having had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Mahathir myself just over a year ago on the margins of the UN General Assembly, I can safely say that it is a true privilege to sit down with him for all of us journalists. The nagging question I still have, though, is how the Prime Minister manages to remain so youthful at the age of 94. Now, an organization that isn't quite renowned for its youthfulness, but that definitely springs to mind when we think of a multipolar world, is the United Nations. Not so much for its General Assembly and the 193 member states who each have one vote, but sadly all too often for the powerful 5 members of its Security Council who after almost 75 years still retain that veto power. So today the question is, as we ponder this issue of a new multipolar world and the new structures that we need, can the UN retain its relevance, its significance, if it holds on to the power structures of the past? Has it become simply an anachronistic organization, or even worse, an organization that is sidelined and increasingly irrelevant? Can it survive another 25 years if it doesn't change fundamentally, doesn't rethink and reimagine its global governance system in a way that is fit for purpose, that is fit for the 21st century? It is my pleasure now to introduce the President of the 74th session of the UN General Assembly, Ambassador Tijani Mohamed Bandi.
His Highness, the Emir of Qatar, Heads of State and Government, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here on the invitation of His Highness, and I thank the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to present my thoughts on a few questions. The Doha Forum presents us with a key moment for dialogue as we enter a new decade. Its theme, dialogue, diplomacy, and diversity, are clearly apt for our time. I'm confident that the conversations we'll have during this forum will deepen existing partnerships and lay the groundwork for forging new ones. Over the past three-quarters of a century, we have seen that when we work together, we are far more successful in our endeavors. This position has just been further strengthened by the reflections of Dr. Mohammed. I firmly believe that working together is the only avenue to addressing common problems and achieving sustainable solutions. The General Assembly debate of the United Nations General Assembly attracts a large number of world leaders every year. This year, the depth of the engagement indicated that far from being outmoded, the United Nations remains relevant. How else would one explain the participation of 192 out of 193 member states of the United Nations? Certainly, it speaks to our relevance. It is, of course, perfectly legitimate to raise questions about the effectiveness of our multilateral order. However, even when we disagree on how the world should be organized to respond to or anticipate mounting challenges, we eventually come to the same conclusion that a rules-based international order is our only guarantee of peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. The General Assembly is the most representative body in the world. Each member state has an equal voice and an equal vote. It does, however, raise questions that only 8% of the speakers at the General Assembly at the opening of its 74th session were female. How can we progress if half of the population is left out of decision-making, economic development, and of peace and security efforts? We learn from listening to one another by heeding the advice that flows from the lived experiences of our sisters and brothers. This is what informs our response to crisis. As we are aware, our commitment as the United Nations is to leave no one behind. This pledge is at the core of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. It is indeed at the core of the United Nations Charter. We must facilitate the full and rightful participation of those who have for too long been marginalized. This includes large population groups, in particular women, persons with disabilities, the elderly, and youth. Through collective action, we can equip these groups to fully participate in decision-making. We must ensure equal access to quality education for everyone, everywhere, in order to lay the groundwork for a more desirable future. Education is an equalizer. The young people who sit in classrooms in 2020 will sit in parliaments, boardrooms, and the General Assembly Hall in 2035 or even earlier. They will shape the post-2030 world. They will negotiate peace. They will address issues of inequality, development, and rights. They will be more sensitive to issues of climate change and environmental justice. They will be even more connected to their peers than any generation before them. We must strengthen the intergenerational conversation. We must give space for youth in our deliberations. Our shared values, excellencies, also resulted in the adoption of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. I was just attending the 25th conference of the parties to the UNFCCC in Madrid. When I left, the negotiation was at a critical stage. We are still awaiting an outcome. The deadline is fast approaching. I commend those who have made pledges in favor of climate finance and commitments to reducing emissions below the agreed cap. We need to expedite financial flows to meet the growing demands for both adaptation and mitigation. It is a key priority of my presidency to strengthen all aspects of financing for development. In particular, we need to build financial integrity and strengthen financial accountability and transparency for achieving the 2030 agenda. This is the key to inclusion. It's also the key to peace. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in a few days, we'll enter a new decade, the decade of action and delivery. This requires us to take action at local, national, and international levels to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Although the ultimate responsibility for this lies with member states, this they cannot accomplish without working with others. Everyone has a responsibility. We must engage all stakeholders, including civil society and private sector, moving forward along the path to 2020 together as a constellation of communities, nations, and organizations. Your Excellencies, it is clear that urgency is key. Everyone, everywhere, can be an agent of positive development. This is how the future is secured and how desirable change happens. For the 74th session of the General Assembly, I am calling for concrete measures to make progress in the areas of peace and security through conflict prevention, poverty eradication and zero hunger, climate action, quality education, and inclusion. As we consider today's challenges, we cannot disregard the immense progress we have made over the past 75 years. We can agree that the United Nations has at times been slow in responding to challenges, and in some instances even made huge mistakes. However, we cannot deny that the United Nations has successfully conducted peace building and peacekeeping around the world. The UN has supported non-proliferation of weapons, supported economic development and trade, facilitated interfaith and intercultural dialogue, promoted self-determination, protected our planet, eradicated polio, halted the spread of Ebola, reduced child mortality, and promoted gender equality and inclusion. These are clearly important global goals. These gains required perseverance and partnership. As such, we cannot adhere to any world order that has space only for some states while disempowering others. Such would be an unstable and dangerous world. We have been there before. We should not revert to that space. That is why the rules-based multilateral order needs our support and care. The founders of the United Nations Organization chose hope over cynicism, empathy over indifference, and partnership over distrust. We must remain steadfast to these ideals as we enter a new decade and a new phase of the organization. Next year, we will commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. We must use the occasion to look beyond the United Nations at 75 toward the centenary of the organization. That we are here in Doha to address a key issue in our world, governance, means that we all agree that global challenges are best addressed collectively. As we strive to make the world a better place for all, I count on your support, and you can count on the United Nations as your partner. I thank you.